Okay, today's speaker is Andrea Ross. She's the author of a fascinating book called Sisters of Influence, the story of three women, Zina, Amy, and Rose Fay, and their involvement in the founding of the Anti-Cruelty Society. Also, the beginning of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and the construction of Orchestra Hall and the expansion of women's sphere of influence in general. Please welcome Andrea Ross.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all. Thank you to Bob and to the wonderful Jill, who, wow, yeah. I have to start by echoing something that Ron said. He had some statistic or something about you being one of the top senior centers in America. And I have to say that based on my experiences, this is my second time here, but my experiences in the general area, yeah, just, yeah. The programming you do is so impressive. And I mean, the tech presentation you just had, I mean, people would absolutely pay to come to that, and you get it free here on a regular basis and all of the activities. It's really impressive what you all do. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you. So this is my newest book, Sisters of Influence. It is a biography of these three sisters, Zina, Amy, and Rose Fay. But before I launch into the stories of the three Fay sisters, I want to take just a moment to put their story into context. At the time that the Fay sisters lived, in the mid and late 1800s, women were meant to stay in the background. The women's sphere was the house, tending to the home and the family. They took pride in that. It was an honor. The public sphere, the outward-facing roles, were for the men. But the men were able to take on these parts and to cement their places in the history books because their homes were run by the women. Their children were raised, their meals were cooked, their clothes were sewn and laundered by the women. So I am not here to negate the efforts of the men, and I am not here to diminish or question the roles that they played. I am here to flush the women out of the shadows. I am here to give them credit for their accomplishments and to recognize the ways in which they challenged these women-shaped boxes into which they had been placed, and to recognize the ways in which they helped gain ground for other women. I am reminded of Abigail Adams's plea to her husband John in 1776 to remember the ladies. John Adams did not heed her plea to include women in the Declaration of Independence. Women's rights would take decades, one could even argue centuries, to take shape. But today, as we consider these three sisters and the roles that they played in organizations such as the Anti-Cruelty Society, the Cooperative Housekeeping Movement, the National Federation of Music Clubs, and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, I ask you to keep in mind that my book is not intended to be a history of any of these organizations or to diminish the roles of others in any way. My intent is to remember the ladies. With that in mind, let's talk about the Fay sisters, Zina, Amy, and Rose. Along the way, I'll share a bit of my writing process as well. As always, with me, it was a bit of a bumpy journey. Much of the material for this book comes from the shelves at the Schlesinger Archives at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And by the way, the Fays have a unique connection to Radcliffe. Often, women's papers have not been kept. In fact, when I consider writing about a woman, I have to investigate first whether there are any materials available. With the Fay sisters, I hit pay dirt. A lifetime of correspondence, newspaper articles, concert reviews, and other materials are cataloged and considered valuable at Schlesinger. But it gets even better than that. In the 1970s, a Fay descendant, Sylvia Wright Mitteracci, found some old trunks in the attic containing all this precious paperwork, years worth of family correspondence, writing, photographs, poems, journals. And Sylvia, a talented writer and editor for Harper's Bazaar, received a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to write a book about Zina Fay, her great aunt. Zina spent years working on the project and created a draft, partial manuscript. Furthermore, she painstakingly organized and in many cases even transcribed the cursive handwriting and cross-hatched script in the copious family letters. Her efforts saved me months, actually more likely years, of work. I was able to build on the work of a woman who came before me. I was aided in my work at the archives by another woman, my daughter, then studying for her master's in library science, and she sat alongside me for a week, diligently taking photographs of every letter, every scrap of paper, and even a snippet of Amy's hair, so I could scrutinize them at leisure back at home. She, thereby, helping a woman who came before her, me. This is how it goes, right? We build on each other. A trip to the Fay family's hometown in St. Albans, Vermont, provided other material, as well as a look at the family home, still standing, and the church, whose construction was overseen by their father. I started this project because I wanted to write about Rose Fay Thomas. I knew that she was the founder of the Anti-Cruelty Society. I knew that she was married to Theodore Thomas, the first conductor of the CSO. What an interesting combination of grit and glamour. I've done a lot of volunteer work in dog rescue, and I used to work for the CSO, so this was the perfect project for me. So I wrote a biography of Rose, cradle to grave, and I sent it to my acquisitions editor at Southern Illinois University, a woman that I admire for her historical knowledge, her writing ability, and her kindness. I'm grateful for her because not all editors are like her. Well, she wrote back. On page 100, she wrote, "Where is Rose?" This is about her sisters. Well, she was right. Rose was the sixth of 7 siblings raised in St. Albans, Vermont. Her mother, Emily, died when Rose was 4. Her mother, Emily, died at age 39. Family lore says Emily died of overwork, done in by the laundry, the cooking, the cleaning, and in particular, the endless sewing pile. Hers was a life of daily drudgery. I would show you a picture of Emily, but I don't believe anybody ever took one. Here's a painting of the family with Emily here at the far left as a child. Her father, John Henry Hopkins, was the Bishop of Vermont. And here's a painting that Emily herself did. She was a very talented artist, musician, and homeopath. But she had precious little time to indulge in these things. The Fay family was quite poor, and they lived a life of hard work. They ran a boarding school out of the back of their home to help supplement Father Charles's small salary from the church. This meant that Emily helped instruct and raise an additional 12 children each year besides her own. The household work took precedence. The household work took her life. Rose's eldest sister, Zina, raised the younger children after Emily's death. And Zina, she was a powerhouse, determined to avenge her mother Emily's death. Zina vowed to restructure a woman's life so no other mothers, no other Emilys would suffer such a dismal fate. All the Fay children were taught at home, but at the age of 20, Zina was given an opportunity to attend the Agassiz School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, run by Elizabeth Cary Agassiz and her husband, Louis Agassiz, one of the nation's most respected scientists, a professor, a museum founder, and the first to suggest that Earth had experienced an ice age. Attending the Agassiz School for Girls was a life-changing opportunity that broadened Zina's narrow world and ultimately those of her siblings. While in Cambridge, Zina met and later married Charles Sanders Peirce, a brilliant logician, philosopher, and scientist. He's considered the father of pragmatism. I don't know what that is. He was a Harvard grad, and all his male family members were involved there too. His father was Benjamin Peirce, the nation's most prominent mathematician. So Zina moved to Cambridge and lived among the intellectual elite. And while Charlie pondered the very existence of life, the cornerstones of reality, Zina pondered the meaning of a woman's life. Zina championed the cause of cooperative housekeeping. She envisioned a world where women could collaboratively accomplish their work, a communal laundry, a neighborhood kitchen, a cooperative store, a dressmaking shop run by women, and she had the audacity to suggest that women get paid for it. Among that Harvard crowd, Zina started her Cambridge cooperative housekeeping venture. They set up that communal laundry, bakery, and store to serve the neighborhood. It failed after a few months. It seemed only Zina was dedicated enough to do the hard work to get it started. But there, she wrote articles for the Atlantic Monthly. She established the Women's Education Institute in an effort to create improved paths for higher education for women that didn't really exist prior. Though some of their efforts failed, it would take nearly another century before women were admitted to the elite men's colleges. Zina was a powerhouse. Oh, her husband, Charlie, had facial neuralgia, which caused terrible pain, miserable moods, perhaps abuse. He self-medicated with ether and opium. But those things were best left unsaid. So by page 100 of my draft, I had written a lot about Zina and a lot about Emily, but very little about Rose, my subject. Oh, and there was Amy, too. Another older sister, Amy, short for Amelia. Despite the fact that the Fay family was poor, poor as the crows and ravens who fed the prophet in the wilderness, as Benjamin Peirce once wrote, Zina, through her persuasion, managed to send Amy abroad. You see, Amy was a very talented musician. A Fay uncle underwrote her studies abroad with assorted piano teachers, including, most famously, Franz Liszt, with whom Amy became quite friendly, joining him in daily games of whist and joining a cluster of young musicians in his jovial, collegial piano masterclasses. Though the great musician was aging, in his prime, he had been one of the very first celebrity musicians, inciting hysteria swooning, fainting among women who attended his concerts. German poet Heinrich Heine had a word for it: listomania. Where Zina was opinionated, driven, and strident, Amy was charming, fun, talented, and she could write. Equally as talented with the pen as on the keyboard. During her years abroad, she sent letters home. Delightful letters detailing not only her musical exploits, but also historical events and cultural observations. More cross-hatched writing for future researchers to decipher. Big sister Zina edited those letters, removing personal family information, and submitted them to the Atlantic Monthly, where they were read by thousands. So when Amy finally returned from her 6 years abroad, people knew her name from those letters. And then Zina took it a step further. She arranged to have more letters published in a book. Music Study in Germany by Amy Fay was published in 1881 and was wildly successful, paving her way into a musical career. That book would have 25 printings and be translated into multiple languages. It wasn't easy back in the late 1800s for a woman to be a concert pianist. It was thought that women's constitutions were too fragile, that they didn't have the stamina to perform long pieces on stage. An 1895 article in Scientific American estimated that women could handle not more than a third, probably, of what men are able to do. Conductors and critics were reluctant to accept women in the field, and Amy began to fight back against that stigma. But she had her own challenges: nerves. Amy struggled terribly with stage fright. According to concert reviews, she had the necessary talent, but she lacked the steady resolve for a concert career. She had failed at her initial goal. Amy didn't accept defeat, though. She developed a new type of performance style, something she called piano conversations, where she spoke to the audience before each piece, calming her nerves and charming the listeners. And in this way, utilizing her innate skills, together with teaching, she managed to make her way in the musical world. Amy never married. She was wed to her career. Amy and Zina founded the Women's Philharmonic of New York, a musical sorority, if you will, to give women performers more opportunities to play publicly. Amy wrote in musical journals and spoke at conferences about the lack of equity for women in music. And here in Chicago, where many of the Fay siblings lived in the 1880s and 1890s, Amy was heavily involved in musical clubs: the Amateur Musical Club, the Artists Club. These organizations helped talented women develop their skills and created networks with other women that got them out of the house, out of that traditional women's sphere that limited them to domestic duties. But you see my problem. We have finally arrived here at minute 15, the equivalent of page 100. Where is Rose? I couldn't leave out these fascinating tidbits of Zina and Amy's lives, but they occurred long before Rose's life became interesting. So what to do about my editor's comments? I rewrote. Instead of a solo biography of Rose, I wrote a family biography of all 7 Fay siblings: Zina, Laura, Amy, Kate, Norman, Rose, and Lily, 6 girls and 1 boy. The other two sons, Alfred St. John and Herman, did not survive childhood. I scrapped the solo biography and I tried again. Though there were sections I could salvage, certainly, I stitched together all 7 storylines, though it was hard to balance because some, like Zina, Amy, and Rose, had so many activities, so many causes, so much to tell. Others, like Laura, Kate, and Lily, were primarily mothers and wives, which, if you ask me, is crucial work. My most important and my most satisfying work was raising 2 functioning human beings. But the mothers weren't written up in the newspapers. They didn't have concert reviews, journal articles, and dissertations written about them. Traditional lives can be more satisfying, richer, and deeply meaningful, but it's the unusual lives we tend to write about. You'll notice I don't even have a picture of Laura. Maybe no one ever took one. Perhaps she wouldn't have wanted one taken. She suffered a severe breakdown as a young mother and pastor's wife, overwhelmed by her responsibilities and by pain and embarrassment after a dentist pulled all of her teeth. In any case, another draft. Like Emily, it was my own type of stitching and sewing, a family quilt of 7 pieces. After months of rewriting, I sent the family biography to my editor, and she sent it off to peer review, though she likely had some reservations of her own, bless her heart. Peer review came back. 2 thoughtful readers, both with advanced degrees, and it was scathing. It did not work as a family biography. 7 lives was too many to care about, and it was so uneven. Chapters on Zina and mere sentences about Lily. So I rewrote a 3rd time. This time, my own invented format, a triple biography. I left the other siblings behind and I focused on 3. Woman's reformer, Zina. Pianist, Amy. And finally, Rose. But there was other disturbing feedback. The peer reviewers felt strongly that the manuscript lacked context. What were other women doing in terms of reform? Were there other female pianists? What made the Fay sisters so remarkable? How did they stack up against others? What was the role of women? What was the role of clubs in women's reform? So I'm not an academic. I have an undergraduate degree in German language and literature, not a master's in gender studies, women's history, music education, anything remotely useful. Though, with any luck, you notice my reference to Heinrich Heine. Got that in there. When I write, it's because these women moved me. I want to share their wonderful stories with others. Look what she did. Look what happened to her. My goal is not to educate. I don't feel particularly qualified to do that, but in writing for a university press, it's an important part of the process. The reviewers were right. So I learned. I pushed aside the imposter syndrome that haunted me and haunts me still. I leaned on fellow biographers who pointed me towards the right sources. I absorbed everything I could on the topics important to the 3 sisters, and slowly, very carefully, I rewrote. Let me introduce you now to Rose Fay Thomas. Finally, thanks for coming. Born 1852 in St. Albans, Vermont. Her mother, Emily Hopkins Fay, died when Rose was 4. They say it was from overwork, technically consumption, tuberculosis. Rose was sent away to live with family friends in Rochester, New York. Perhaps it was to ease the load on her overwhelmed father, Charles Fay, an Episcopalian rector. Perhaps it was to bring some cheer into a depressed household that had lost 2 sons, one in a tragic swimming accident. Rose lived with the Selden family in Rochester, who, by the way, were involved with Frederick Douglass and who represented Susan B. Anthony when she attempted to vote in the 1872 election. But once Rose's older sister Zina, a powerhouse, married philosopher-scientist Charles Sanders Peirce and moved to Cambridge, she schlepped her younger siblings behind her like a sisterly Pied Piper, determined that they would have better lives than their mother had had. Somehow, Zina managed to land a seat for young Rose in the home of poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, where the governess was teaching Longfellow's girls, Alice, Edith, and Annie, who were roughly Rose's age. Rose enjoyed a close relationship with the Longfellow family, even prompting this lovely little ditty from the poet himself on a later Christmas. To the Rose of Roses and the Fay of Fays, health and happiness, length of days, and all good wishes and all good ways. Christmas, 1876. We don't all have Longfellow poems written to us. Aside from this remarkable opportunity with the Longfellow clan, Rose's life was pretty ordinary until she hit her mid-30s. Not a lot to, write home about. Along with 4 siblings, Rose moved to Chicago, where brother Norman had a good job with a telephonic exchange, an endeavor based on a popular new invention. Normie loved new inventions. The telephone, the typewriter, the airplane, he championed them all to the best of his abilities. The siblings lived together in a home on Bellevue Place, the north side of the city. Rose, along with her older sister Amy, yes, the pianist and author, enjoyed the activities of the amateur musical club, and Rose served in various leadership roles, eventually becoming their president. And the Fay family gradually befriended a traveling musician, Theodore Thomas, the nation's foremost orchestral conductor. Classical music was largely unknown in the States in the mid-1800s. Before radio or recordings, in order to hear music, it had to be live. And there were very, very few good full-size classical orchestras. New York had one, but it only performed a handful of concerts each year. The Theodore Thomas Orchestra was largely considered to be the best. They were primarily a traveling ensemble, transversing the country for months on end by train, schlepping their instruments and belongings, creating what became known as the Theodore Thomas Highway. Chicago was one of the regular stops of this annual rail journey across the United States. One of Theodore's biographers called him the Johnny Appleseed of music. I love that idea, planting classical music around the country. It was tiring work, all that travel. Theodore did everything: booking events, selling tickets, rehearsing, finding soloists. As he aged, he grew weary of the travel, weary of the hard work, never of the music. When in Chicago, he stayed at a boarding house run by Zina Fay Peirce, now divorced, though shh, don't say anything about that. That's best left unsaid. The Fays were all classical music fans, and Norman deeply admired Theodore Thomas. When the Theodore Thomas Orchestra disbanded in the late 1880s, too much travel, too much work, Norman had a suggestion. Would you come to Chicago if we could give you a permanent orchestra? Normie asked Theodore. I'd go to hell if they gave me a permanent orchestra, Theodore replied. After Theodore's first wife, Minna Rhodes Thomas, died, Theodore found comfort in Rose. And at age 37, Having already watched her younger sister Lily wed, Rose finally had a love and a life of her own. This coincided with Norman's offer to start afresh in Chicago. And so, with a new wife, a new family, a new city, a new orchestra, Theodore started over in Chicago. Those first years were not easy for the orchestra. They struggled with a deficit each year and were only kept afloat thanks to their loyal guarantors and trustees. Theodore and Rose became music royalty in Chicago. She led the amateur music club into new directions. And at the 1893 World's Fair, Rose invited other amateur music clubs from around the country. And over the course of 4 days in June, they shared music, ideas, and camaraderie. From this eventually came the formation of the National Federation of Music Clubs, an organization that is still going strong. With over 90,000 members, it is the nation's largest nonprofit organization that supports American music performers and music education. It is the only musical organization of the United Nations. And of course, you know of the organization that Theodore built, the Chicago Orchestra, later the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. It was the lasting gift that Theodore gave to our city, his attention to detail, his quest for perfection, his determination to spread great music to the masses, enriched our city beyond measure. Towards the end of Theodore's life, concerned that his orchestra might not outlive him, he insisted on the construction of a new concert hall specifically for the orchestra. The old hall, the auditorium, still standing, was too large to fill on a regular basis, making subscription sales difficult as last-minute tickets were always available. Norman and the trustees spearheaded a fundraising campaign to make a new building possible. For some months, it appeared that the campaign would falter. Not enough donations from big money donors. But then the people of Chicago came through from all corners of the city and all aspects of the community came small donations, whatever people could afford, determined to save their top-notch orchestra. As Norman said, literally, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker were there. In December of 1904, Theodore conducted the first concert in Orchestra Hall at 220 South Michigan Avenue. 1 month later, he was gone. Telephone operators that day announced Theodore Thomas is dead before making phone connections. Rose grieved the loss of her beloved, but she continued on with the work of her life, including her passion for animals. One of her greatest accomplishments was the founding of the Anti-Cruelty Society. One of the first issues that they tackled was conditions for carriage and draft horses, frequently maltreated on the streets and in the factories of the city. Rose and the other volunteers, outfitted with silver badges from the police department, would stand on busy street corners and at the inclines to bridges, carrots, apples, and sugar cubes in their pockets, watching for drivers mistreating their horses, pulling heavily overloaded carriages. And the volunteers coaxed the horses while chastising the drivers. Consider the courage that took. Berating delivery drivers, standing up against cruelty. The women attended legal hearings, installed water fountains and troughs for the animals, held community meetings, created animal care clubs for children, and recruited thousands of volunteers. They spoke out against the use of feathers and other bird parts on women's hats. Sorry, I don't know why the text boxes are a little off here, but they eventually built a shelter at 459 East Division Street, where they took in stray dogs and cats and found them new homes. And in those early years, they even intervened in cases of abuse against women and children. Anti-cruelty in all forms. It wasn't easy, but it was right. Rose became known as a leader in the movement for compassion, speaking out against inappropriate toys for young boys, the toy pistols, the tin soldiers, the slingshots, and the play whips. She suggested that they learn to nurture animals instead. Rose found time, too, to author 2 books, a biography of her beloved husband, and Our Mountain Garden, a charming book about discovering the love of gardening at their summer home, Felsen Garden, in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Rose's memoir about gardening illustrates her compassionate nature as she shares her patient efforts at coaxing the plants and native animals to coexist peacefully alongside Rose and Theodore. Several years before her death, on her 70th birthday, Rose was honored by the National Federation of Music Clubs. Individual clubs around the country performed concerts in her honor. And Rose was invited out to Los Angeles, where the local chapter hosted a concert at the Hollywood Bowl. Rose receiving an armful of flowers and a standing ovation, honors usually bestowed upon her husband. In the last years of her life, Rose devoted many hours to volunteer organizations helping the servicemen who returned from the war. Her work was so considerable that when she died in 1929 at age 76, she was afforded a military funeral. Whoops, there's Felsen Garden. Sorry. There's the military funeral. Only the 4th woman in the United States to receive one. Zina, Amy, and Rose all followed their interests and made advances in various arenas. These are not the typical suffragist stories that we've all heard. Women who advocated for decades for the right to vote. In fact, the Fay women, like so many women of their day, did not originally believe that women belonged in the voting booth. Yeah, this was hard for me to understand. Part of me wishes that they had been among those early firebrands fighting for equal rights. But change is gradual, and they had been raised to believe that the woman's sphere was a sphere above, higher, nobler, more pure than the man's position. Women were the moral guidelights of society, the heart of home and family. Voting was about war and taxes and politics. To place women in the voting booths was to expose them to atrocities best kept far from the family. I still struggle with this, but I have learned that I cannot judge the women of previous generations, the ladies of different circumstances than my own. Women's reform was far broader than the vote. It encompassed issues such as working outside the home, property rights, higher education, just to name a few. I do know that these 3 Fay sisters helped expand the woman's sphere, breaking out of that restrictive Victorian household where women were solely domestic. Women's clubs were crucial steps in getting women out into the community, groups by women for women. They were initially seen as innocuous gatherings, and bit by bit, they provided opportunities for women to practice management skills, educate themselves, build alliance, and organize in ways that paved the path for the progressive era. And today, these clubs remain vital hubs for many women throughout our communities. Zina, in the end, felt a failure. Many of her ideas had fallen flat. Cooperative housekeeping never came to be. Unfortunately, I would benefit from that. Higher education for women was still decades away. Many elite men's colleges didn't admit women until the 1960s. A novel that Zina toiled over for 2 decades was poorly received, but she wrote dozens of newspaper articles on women's issues, and her passion, her arguments, and her courage helped raise questions and further the discussion about women's roles. Amy's concert career was hardly what she had hoped, her nerves never allowing her to perform as brilliantly as she was able. But she was able to pivot and to make inroads in music that made the path easier for women behind her. And Rose's efforts, both in music and in humane undertakings, had lasting results. Though, to the end, her greatest personal satisfaction had been in being Theodore's wife and helpmeet. This book is not the book I intended to write. A similar thing happened with my first book, Edith, the Rogue Rockefeller McCormick, which went through 6 different versions and literally hundreds of rejections over 10 years before a convincing, cohesive version emerged. And this is why the warm support that I get from groups like yours matters so dearly to me, to writers. In the end, with help from many people, both books were better than my initial concepts. Like the sisters, my path has been one of adapting. Failure is sometimes part of the journey. It often comes with a large dose of humble pie. What matters, though, is that we keep going. What matters, though, is that we keep an eye on the horizon. Each one of us has a different path, unique skills, personal beliefs, and it is through expressing them however we can that we might hope to exact change. Thank you.
Andrea, that was wonderful. You're relating that story. You did it so well. And you have a couple books here. Can you tell us a little? You have told us a little bit about them, but they're available for sale, correct?
Yes, I did bring some books. I would like to donate one of my, you already have Edith in your library here, but I'd like to donate one of the sisters' copies to your library, so you can get it through there. But I'm also happy to sell them here. So
for that, and
yeah.
then Joe will be happy to receive that for the North Shore Senior Center.
Thank you.
We'll take questions from our group here first, then we'll see if there's any in Zoom. Okay, I see one here. I'll get some exercise. Good.
I'm just, excuse me, I'm just looking here on Amazon, and I don't see the books. Where would they be available?
They are available on Amazon.
Pardon?
They are on Amazon. Try looking them up by the title.
Well, all right.
Other questions over here?
Yes, I don't have a question. I just have a comment that it's so hard to believe that the equality of women has come so late, even in our lives, in our lifetimes. Someone once said that behind every great man, there's a great woman. And that's so true, I think, in many of our lives where our mothers were not really permitted or trained to have a career, but they kept our father on track and encouraging and steering all the way along the line. And it's equally difficult for me to understand how there are some now who want to reverse some of that, some of our politicians.
Yes. Yes, thank you for those comments. It was a learning curve for me to learn about this family of clearly very intelligent and very driven women who didn't want the vote, who felt that wasn't a good idea. And Zina had all sorts of other ideas about how to advance the woman's cause, but they didn't feel that the vote was the right way to go. So it was a lesson to me in how slowly new ideas are incorporated often, how long it takes to exact change within an entire country, right? I mean, that it's a hard battle. And the women were often at odds. Has anybody seen Suffs? Oh, it was on television. I saw it the other day. It's a Broadway musical about the suffragists. Fantastic. I think it's still available for streaming. I highly encourage you to see it. Very entertaining, and really talks about the friction within the women's movement and how people felt about moving, how how they felt we should move forward, because there were a lot of different routes. So very interesting. And yes, I mean, it's still an issue. In many ways, women have restrictions upon them that men don't. The Equal Rights Act never passed. Excuse me. Don't know where that's coming from. And while my daughter and I were at Schlesinger on the last day of our visit there, they overturned Roe v. Wade. So, I mean, Schlesinger is just a bastion of women's history, and it was really interesting to be there on that particular day, which will go down in history. So thank you for your comments.
I have a comment. I actually have a second comment.
Great.
The second comment is first that growing up in the 60s and 70s, many of us probably remember how splintered the feminist movement was. Trying to find a voice in a time and, avoid it being called broadening. But the other comment, the initial comment I wanted to make, it was to commend you for persevering with the rejections. About 6 weeks ago, I attended a talk in Evanston by Jane Hamilton, who, as many people may know, is a prize-winning author of at least 13 different books.
Yeah.
And she was describing her most recent book and the fact that it had been rejected, 10, 15 times before she found the story that was meant to be told. And I remember saying to her how astonished I was that an author who is as well-known and esteemed as she is could have experienced that in her most recent book. And so it's not unusual. And as I said, you're to be commended for persevering.
Oh, well, thank you. I am horrifically stubborn. My brother-in-law is in the audience. He can probably attest to that. But once I have an idea in my head, I have to follow through. And at a certain point with Edith, that took me 10 years, right? And 6 entirely different treatments of it. At a certain point, I had so much information. I had invested so much in this. And I was certain that her story was worth telling, that I could either just quit and completely fail, or I could just try again, right? So I just kept trying again. I'm glad I did in the end. It was worth it. Yes. Yes, in the back.
Thanks for such a lovely presentation.
Thank
I'm
you.
curious about Rose and her connection to animals, because it sounds like animals were really low on the totem pole, so to speak. So was there like an animal in her life, or how did that come to be one of her callings?
Yes, thank you for the question.
Yeah, let me add on to that.
Yep.
I was shocked to hear that it wasn't just animals, that anti-cruelty was the message. And it just, the thought whenever I hear it as a kid has always been starving dogs and let's help them. So her view was certainly much broader and wiser than mine.
Yes, it was interesting to me. I also, when I think of anti-cruelty, I think of dogs and cats, right? But first of all, the carriage horses and the draft horses, that was one of the driving forces for this organization. That was really interesting to me, and I felt like people needed to know that. And then that they intervened in many cases of abuse for women and children. That was also quite interesting. But I think, to answer your question back there, and I'm going to slide over because now I can't see you. Oh, there, you could slide over. There you go. I think that, I think she had a kind heart to begin with. And she often had dogs throughout her life. But I really think that a lot of it came from their summer home up in New Hampshire, where, she wrote this book, Our Mountain Garden, and it is so sweet how she takes care of all these animals. And when somebody suggested that they shoot the squirrels on their property, instead she built a little picnic table for them on a branch and would put nuts on there every day. And she was able to have hummingbirds land in her hand. She was just a very quiet, gentle presence. And I think that's also kind of what I admired so much about her. Zina was brazen. She was out there. I have something to say. I want you to hear what it is. I want you to agree with me. Rose was gentle and often worked behind the scenes, but was tremendously effective. And I just think that today, that's an important thing to remember, is that no matter what our personality, no matter what our style is, no matter even what our issue is, we can exact change in various ways.
Two comments. One is that I think they must have had a very supportive and strengthening family environment to have three children engage in such dynamic careers outside or activities outside their home. And the other is they were also very fortunate. These three women survived into their 80s, which was also very unusual in that era.
Yes. Yes, absolutely true. Although I have to say, one of the leading causes of death for women at that time was childbirth. And none of them did. None of them had children. But yes, they grew up in a very small town in Vermont in very modest circumstances. And look what they became. Look what they did. It's really inspiring.
They also lived longer than the average at that time.
They did, yes.
I had a question that maybe you just answered, that they maybe couldn't afford paper, but the way they wrote over, do you know what what the reason was? Was it money? Were they sending it and stamps were expensive or whatever?
Yes, all of those things, right? So first of all, it's on that, you remember that thin, like airmail paper, like onion skin like paper, right? So they would write on one side, they'd flip it over and write on the other side in cursive, all of it. And then they'd flip it back. And as you saw, they would write sideways and sometimes in the margins, but sometimes right over it. And they got quite good at reading that. But to our eyes, it's very difficult to read. And it was, I think, to save on paper and to save on postage.
And just an aside, I was very intrigued since my first name is Fay.
Oh, perfect. Yes.
I tell people that my two greatest accomplishments in life was meeting my second wife strictly by fate and having our daughter. And to me, that's the most important thing.
Yes.
And I'm supportive of women. And my wife and I, for about the past year, we've taken my mom in, and she turned 99 in March. Wow. And I'm her caregiver. And my wife tells me she doesn't know how I do it. And I say, how can I not do it?
Yeah.
So I want her to live as long as she possibly can.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. You have your priorities straight, that family is first, and that precedes anything else that we may accomplish in our lives.
Last question. You write about women that made a difference.
Yes.
You're a woman that makes a difference.
Thank you.
You have also
Thank you.
My guess is that you didn't have all of the barriers that they had. But
Correct.
you still have some, and so do the women here, and they're even on our grandkids, unfortunately. But how do you deal with being a woman that had a life beyond just being an author? Did you have kids? You know, are you the mom? You mentioned your daughter, so how did they handle saying, "Well, I understand we don't need lunch. Mom's an author." How did that work for someone trying to make a difference and be a good mom?
Well, thank you. Personal question. Wow, I don't get many of those, but thank you. Well, I started out working for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. I was their operations manager for a few years, and then I worked for Brookfield Zoo as the assistant to the director. And then I had a couple kids. I'd written Brookfield Zoo's history book while I was working there, and I really loved that process. I mean, first of all, it's such a rich history, right? Great animal stories and so on. And I thought, someday I'd like to write something more. But I had two children, and I feel like for many years I couldn't even finish a thought, let alone a sentence or a paragraph. You're just focused on what has to happen right then and there. But then as my kids got older, I thought, I'd heard about Edith Rockefeller McCormick, and I thought that is a really interesting character, and there's no book about her. I'd like to write something about her. So then I started in on that. And I do think, Ron, that you're right, that my daughter, I think, was 8 when I started. My son was probably 13. I do think for a while they were like, "Okay, Mom, we really don't care what you learned today about Edith." It's like having a new baby in the house, and all the focus was on Edith, only she's a dead woman. So, but then they were old enough at a certain point, to understand. And in the end, it ended up being, I think, a good object lesson for the kids, that they saw me struggle for 10 years. They saw me get kicked down for 10 years with all these rejections, and yet I persevered. And I think that's a lesson for them. An inadvertent lesson, to be sure. I wish it quite hadn't gone that way, but yeah. So, yes. So,
Okay, if there are no more questions, Andrea, thank you so much. Please give Andrea a hand.